The Amazon River, vast and relentless, winds its way through the heart of South America, shaping a land so immense it feels boundless. Brazil, the giant of the continent, pulses with life in every corner. Its soil carries stories of triumph, struggle, and resilience. The whispers of history cling to the wind that sweeps across its savannas, rustles through its rainforests, and rushes down its rivers. From the towering peaks of the Serra do Mar to the endless plains of the Pampas, this land is alive with a rhythm all its own. The Atlantic Ocean crashes against the eastern coastline, its waves a constant reminder of the days when foreign ships arrived, seeking fortune and conquest. Long before that, however, this land was already a home. Indigenous peoples thrived in its vast expanse, weaving their lives into its rivers, mountains, and forests. They knew the language of the land, the songs of the howler monkeys, the hum of the cicadas at dusk, and the silent patience of the jaguar as it prowled the jungle. Each region of Brazil is a world in itself, defined by its own climate, culture, and spirit. In the north, the Amazon sprawls like a living, breathing organism, its canopy sheltering countless species, its rivers teeming with life. To the south, the highlands sweep gently toward Argentina, dotted with gauchos tending to their cattle. Along the coast, cities rise with their unique rhythms, Salvador with its Afro-Brazilian heartbeat, Rio de Janeiro with its breathtaking beauty, and Sao Paulo with its restless energy. The colors of Brazil are unmatched. The golden hues of its beaches, the green tapestry of its forests, and the fiery reds and oranges of the Cerrado's sunset, each tells a story of abundance. But these vibrant shades are not limited to the natural world. They are also in the culture of its people. The pounding drums of samba and the graceful movements of capoeira speak of histories that cannot be erased, of traditions born from joy and pain. The streets come alive during Carnival, when every corner bursts into a cacophony of music and color, a reminder of a spirit that refuses to be subdued. Brazil's past is not without scars. The Atlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to its shores, their lives stolen but their spirits unbroken. They carried with them their music, their beliefs, their resilience. This blending of cultures, indigenous, African, European, created something new, something uniquely Brazilian. It is a land of contrasts, where opulent mansions stand not far from favelas, where ancient traditions live alongside modernity. For centuries, this land has beckoned dreamers and adventurers. The Portuguese saw its wealth in the vast forests of pau-brasil, the tree that gave the country its name. The gold rush of the 18th century filled its towns with the clink of coins and the cries of miners. But it also drew the hands of the oppressed, working under the harsh gaze of colonial rulers. Every stone laid in the grand churches of Minas Gerais carries the weight of those who were forced to labor. Even in its struggles, Brazil stands as a testament to the indomitable human spirit. From the fight for independence to the abolition of slavery, from the birth of the republic to the turbulent years of dictatorship, the people of Brazil have always risen to reclaim their voices. Their stories are etched into the fabric of the nation, a mosaic of courage and determination. The land itself feels alive, almost sentient. The Amazon rainforests pulse with energy, sheltering countless lives under its sprawling canopy. The Pantanal, the world's largest tropical wetland, glimmers with its waters and teems with jaguars, caimans, and macaws. These ecosystems are a gift and a challenge, a constant reminder of the delicate balance between preservation and progress. Cultural richness flows like the rivers that crisscross the nation. The tales of indigenous peoples, handed down through generations, tell of gods who shaped the world and spirits who guard it. Afro-Brazilian traditions like candomblé and umbanda carry echoes of the ancestors who first sang their songs in faraway lands. The rhythm of the berimbau and a capoeira rota and the haunting melodies of bossa nova are testaments to the enduring creativity of Brazil's people. Every corner of this country holds stories of ambition and survival. The streets of Salvador are alive with echoes of resistance, where enslaved peoples once planned revolts under the watchful eyes of colonial oppressors. In the heart of the Amazon, indigenous leaders fight tirelessly to protect their ancestral lands from encroachment. The bustling markets of Sao Paulo tell of migrants who arrived with nothing but hope and built lives from the ground up. Even Brazil's contradictions are striking. It is a land of breathtaking natural beauty, yet faces devastating deforestation. It is a leader in agricultural exports, yet grapples with issues of inequality and food insecurity. Its cities are vibrant hubs of innovation, but they also reveal the shadows of its colonial past. Each contrast is a thread in the fabric of Brazil's history, weaving a tapestry both beautiful and complex. Through it all, Brazil endures, its spirit unbroken. Its people carry within them a fierce pride and an unyielding hope. They gather in churches to sing hymns of faith and on soccer fields to cheer for their teams with unmatched fervor. They laugh, cry, and celebrate life in ways that feel larger than life itself. And as the sun sets over its mountains, rivers, and beaches, the land seems to breathe with the promise of tomorrow, a promise forged by the struggles and triumphs of its past. In the stillness of the Amazon forest, a faint hum of voices could once be heard, soft chants rising and falling like waves against the dense green walls. A fire crackled in the center of the village, its glow casting dancing shadows on faces painted with symbols of their ancestors. These were the first Brazilians, people whose connection to the land was as old as the rivers that carved through it. Their song spoke of gods who lived in the trees, spirits who swam in the rivers, and ancestors who watched over them in the stars. Long before the arrival of foreign ships, the Tupi walked these lands, their feet leaving no scars on the earth. Their villages, stretched along the coastlines and riverbanks, buzzed with life. Children laughed as they ran through fields of manioc, and hunters returned with the spoils of the forest, peccaries and capybaras carried on broad shoulders. For the Tupi, the land wasn't something to conquer, it was a mother who nourished them, a protector who demanded respect. Their world was alive with meaning. Every tree, every stone, every creature had a story. The jaguar wasn't just a predator, it was a spirit, a symbol of strength and mystery. The parrots that painted the sky with flashes of green and red were not mere birds, but messengers of the divine. The Tupi spoke of a time when humans and animals lived as one, a sacred bond that echoed in their chants and rituals. Further south, the Guarani wove their own tales. To them, life was a journey toward the land without evil, a paradise where suffering ended and harmony reigned. They moved with the seasons, guided by the wisdom of their shamans, who read the stars and interpreted dreams. Their language, melodic and rich, was a bridge to the spiritual world. It carried the weight of prayers, the joy of celebrations, and the sorrow of farewells. Guarani villages were circles of unity. Families gathered under the shade of towering trees, sharing meals of maize and fish, their laughter mingling with the rustling of leaves. The elders told stories of creation, their voices filled with reverence. They spoke of Nhandaru, the first father, who shaped the world with his breath, and of the spirits who guarded the forests and rivers. These stories were not mere tales, but truths that guided their lives, teaching them respect for the land and each other. In the vast, untouched expanse of the Amazon, the Yanomami lived in harmony with a world that many would find unforgiving. Their malocas, large communal homes, stood as testaments to their unity. Life within was a tapestry of shared labor, laughter, and rituals. The Yanomami knew the forest like no one else. Its labyrinth of trees and rivers was not a wilderness, but a home filled with medicines, food, and sacred places. For the Yanomami, dreams held the key to understanding life. Through dreams, they connected with the Hikura, powerful spirits who shaped their destiny. Shamans, adorned with feathers and painted with vibrant dyes, guided their people through illness and uncertainty. Their chants, rhythmic and hypnotic, were bridges between the seen and unseen worlds. The forest listened, its creatures moving in quiet harmony, as if honoring the sacred rituals taking place beneath its canopy. These indigenous peoples spoke hundreds of languages, each one a unique thread in the fabric of their world. Words carried not just meaning but power, the power to heal, to bless, to protect. Language was not separate from life, it was life. It flowed through their songs, prayers, and conversations, binding them to each other and the land. Their spiritual beliefs were as vast and intricate as the landscapes they called home. The Tupi believed in the Great Snake, a guardian of rivers and life itself. The Guarani saw the stars as ancestors watching over them, their light a reminder of the bonds between the heavens and the earth. The Yanomami revered the forest as the giver of life, its spirits dwelling in every tree, stream, and shadow. But life was not always peaceful. Tribes defended their territories fiercely, their warriors skilled in the art of the bow and arrow. Battles were not just physical but spiritual. Victory was a sign of divine favor, and rituals followed every conflict to restore balance. Yet, even in times of strife, their respect for the land remained unbroken. They fought not to dominate but to protect the world they held sacred. Festivals brought moments of joy and connection. During these times, villages transformed into vibrant gatherings of color and sound. Feathers and beads adorned their bodies, and the air filled with the beat of drums and the melody of flutes. These celebrations were more than revelry, they were acts of gratitude to the land, to their ancestors, and to the spirits who sustained them. Through countless generations, the first Brazilians built their lives on foundations of harmony and respect. They knew that the land was not theirs to own, but theirs to care for. They walked lightly, their footprints fading quickly, leaving the earth as they found it, whole, alive, sacred. The air in the Amazon was thick and alive, carrying the scent of damp earth and the sound of leaves whispering secrets to the wind. Towering trees stood like ancient guardians, their roots gripping the soil as if cradling the world itself. Beneath their sprawling canopy, life flourished in ways that seemed almost magical. Birds painted the sky with flashes of color, scarlet macaws, toucans with their vibrant bills, and tiny hummingbirds whose wings beat faster than the eye could see. The forest was a symphony, its rhythm dictated by the rustle of leaves, the hum of insects, and the distant roar of a jaguar. This was no ordinary place. It was a realm where everything was connected, a web of life so intricate it seemed impossible to unravel. Streams twisted through the undergrowth, their waters shimmering with silver flashes of fish. The trees reached skyward, their trunks draped with vines and orchids. Some bore fruits so rich and sweet they seemed like gifts from the gods. Others held secrets within their bark and leaves, medicines that could heal wounds, cure fevers, or soothe aching spirits. To the people who lived here, the forest was not just a backdrop to life, it was life itself. The Tupi, Guarani, Yanomami, and countless other tribes knew the land as a provider and a teacher. From the Amazon's rivers, they drew fish that fed their families. The waters teemed with life, piranhas, catfish, and the great arapaima, whose scales shimmered like jewels. These rivers were highways too, paths that carried canoes laden with goods to trade with neighboring tribes. The Atlantic forests, further to the east, were a different kind of wonder. They stretched along the coastline, lush and dense, with a beauty that could steal your breath. Here, the trees grew in layers, giants with branches that seemed to touch the clouds, and smaller ones beneath, forming a green cascade down to the forest floor. Birds flitted between the branches, their songs echoing in the cool shade. The land smelled of salt from the nearby sea, mingled with the earthy perfume of the woods. The people who lived along these coasts used the resources around them with care and skill. They planted manioc in the clearings, turning its roots into a flower that could last for months. They fished in the ocean, pulling in nets heavy with fish, shrimp, and crabs. From the forests, they gathered fruits like guava and jabuticaba, their hands sticky with juice as they shared the harvest with their families. Trade was the lifeblood of these communities. In the markets set up along riverbanks or in forest clearings, the sounds of bartering filled the air. A hunter would exchange fresh meat for woven baskets. A shaman might offer healing herbs in return for pottery. These trades weren't just about goods, they were about relationships, alliances, and the trust that bound people together. The land itself seemed to provide without end. There were palm trees whose nuts yielded oil and food, vines that could be woven into strong ropes, and plants that gave dyes as vivid as the sunset. The indigenous people didn't take blindly, they understood balance. For every tree cut, another was planted. For every fish caught, they left some to spawn. They lived with the land, not against it, and it gave back in abundance. The Atlantic forests were also home to wild animals that roamed freely, their movements a part of the land's rhythm. Jaguars prowled silently, their golden eyes catching the moonlight. Sloths hung lazily from branches, their fur blending into the mossy bark. Monkeys swung from tree to tree, their calls echoing like laughter. Each creature had a place, a role in the intricate dance of the forest. In the heart of the Amazon, the mighty Brazil nut tree reigned supreme. Its seeds, locked inside hard, round shells, were treasures sought by both animals and people. Tribes gathered these nuts to eat, sharing their creamy richness around fires that crackled through the night. But they also left enough for the agudas, small rodents whose gnawing teeth helped crack open the shells, allowing new trees to grow. It was a perfect cycle, nature and humanity working in harmony. Medicinal plants were another gift of this land. The shamans, wise and patient, knew which leaves could heal a fever or which bark could ease pain. They spoke to the forest as if it were alive, and it answered, revealing its secrets. These remedies weren't just practical, they were sacred. A cure wasn't just for the body but for the soul, a reminder of the bonds between people and the earth. The Atlantic forests and Amazon rainforests were more than homes or resources, they were sanctuaries of life, places where every creature, plant, and person had a purpose. And in this world, abundance wasn't measured in wealth or power but in the richness of connection. Every tree, every river, every stone held meaning. And the people, guided by a deep respect for the land, thrived in a balance that seemed almost otherworldly. The ocean stretched endlessly, an expanse of blue that seemed to swallow the horizon. The Portuguese ship cut through the waves, its sails billowing like ghostly wings against the sky. On board, the crew whispered prayers, their faces weary from months at sea. The salty air stung their skin, and the vastness of the unknown loomed before them. Then, on April 22, 1500, a cry broke the stillness. Land. A sliver of green appeared, a lush, untamed world rising from the waters. Pedro Alvarez Cabral stood on the deck, his gaze fixed on the distant shoreline. He didn't yet know the name of this land or the lives it held. For him and his men, this was a new world, a place of possibility. But for those who had called it home for generations, this arrival would mark the beginning of a storm that would shake their lives to the core. The ships anchored near what would one day be known as Porto Seguro. The Portuguese sailors stepped onto the soft, golden sands, their boots sinking into the warmth of the earth. Around them, the land pulsed with life. Towering trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves shimmering like emeralds in the sun. Birds called out from the canopy, their songs weaving a melody that echoed through the air. From the shadows of the forest, watchful eyes observed the newcomers. The indigenous people, members of the Tupi tribe, had lived here long before the sails of foreign ships darkened the horizon. They moved silently, their painted bodies blending with the natural world. To them, the arrival of the Portuguese was strange, almost otherworldly. Who were these men, pale as the moon, with their heavy clothing and strange languages? When the two groups met, it was with a cautious curiosity. The Tupi stepped forward, their movements deliberate, their faces calm. The Portuguese offered trinkets, mirrors, beads, and small metal tools. The Tupi examined these gifts with interest but without awe. They, too, had much to offer, feathers so vibrant they seemed to hold sunlight, fruits so sweet they tasted like paradise. For a moment, it seemed like an exchange of equals, a meeting of two worlds. But beneath the surface, the differences were vast. The Portuguese saw land ripe for conquest, forests filled with riches, and people who might be converted to their faith. The Tupi, meanwhile, wondered about the intentions of these strangers who had arrived unbidden, their ships like wooden beasts resting on the waves. The Treaty of Tordesillas had already divided the world between the Portuguese and the Spanish. Signed in 1494, it was a line drawn on a map, a decision made in distant lands without a thought for the people who lived on either side of it. According to the treaty, this newfound territory fell under Portuguese control, though the Tupi and other indigenous tribes had never heard of such agreements. To them, the land wasn't something to be claimed or divided, it was sacred, a part of who they were. As the days passed, the Portuguese began to explore. They marveled at the richness of the land, the towering pau-Brazil trees with their red-hued wood that could be turned into valuable dyes. They saw rivers that flowed like veins through the earth, teeming with fish, and forests alive with sounds and movement. To them, it was a treasure chest waiting to be opened. The Tupi shared their knowledge with these newcomers, teaching them how to navigate the rivers, hunt in the forests, and prepare manioc, the root that sustained their people. They welcomed the Portuguese into their villages, offering food and shelter. But the Tupi also watched, their eyes keen, their instincts sharp. They understood the fragility of this new relationship, sensing the unspoken intentions of their guests. On the beaches, the Portuguese raised a wooden cross, its shadow stretching across the sand as the sun dipped low in the sky. They knelt before it, their prayers rising like smoke into the heavens. To them, this was a declaration, a claiming of the land in the name of their king and their god. But for the Tupi, the cross was a strange object, its meaning unclear. They observed silently, their thoughts guarded. There were moments of tension, flashes of misunderstanding that hinted at the storm to come. The Portuguese, unused to the ways of the Tupi, struggled to interpret their customs and beliefs. The Tupi, in turn, grew wary of the demands and expectations of their visitors. Beneath the surface of their interactions, a quiet unease began to grow. As the Portuguese prepared to leave, they loaded their ships with pau-Brazil wood, their first taste of the wealth this land could offer. They left behind promises to return, words spoken with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. The Tupi watched as the ships disappeared over the horizon, their sails shrinking to specks against the vast blue sky. For the Portuguese, this was the beginning of a new chapter, a foothold in a land of abundance. But for the Tupi and the countless other tribes who called this place home, it was the first ripple of a wave that would soon crash against their shores. The land, so full of life and promise, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The trees stood tall, the rivers flowed on, and the people, bound to this land by history and spirit, prepared for a future that even they could not yet fully see. The scent of burning cane filled the air, heavy and sharp, carried by the wind across endless fields of grain. The sun bore down mercilessly, casting long shadows over the land where workers toiled, their bodies bent beneath the weight of labor. The earth beneath them was stained with sweat and tears, a silent witness to the struggle unfolding in the heart of Brazil. The sugar plantations stretched as far as the eye could see, their rows of cane standing tall, almost mocking in their beauty. Sweetness for some, sorrow for others. The dream of wealth drove the Portuguese deeper into this land. Sugar, a treasure that glistened in the minds of European merchants, promised fortunes beyond imagination. The Atlantic world craved it, from the grand courts of Lisbon to bustling markets in London and Amsterdam. To feed this hunger, Brazil became a landscape transformed, a land of plantation owners who sought prosperity and workers who paid the price. At first, the Portuguese looked to the indigenous people to work the fields. They captured them, uprooting lives and shattering communities. But the indigenous resisted fiercely, escaping into the dense forests or succumbing to diseases brought by the Europeans, diseases against which their bodies had no defense. The plantations demanded more labor, more hands, more lives. So the ships began to come, their bellies filled with human cargo. From the shores of Africa, men, women, and children were torn from their villages, their families, their worlds. Shackled and chained, they were packed into the dark holds of vessels that crossed the Atlantic like silent ghosts. The journey was a nightmare. The air below deck was thick and suffocating, the cries of despair mingling with the creak of the ship's timbers and the relentless crash of the waves. Many would never see the light of day again. For those who survived, the sight of Brazil's coast brought no relief. They were herded onto plantations, where their lives became a cycle of endless labor. Under the watchful eyes of overseers, they worked from sunrise to sunset, cutting cane, hauling it to mills, and feeding it into crushing machines that turned the stalks into syrup. Their hands bore the scars of machetes, their backs bent beneath the weight of their burden. The heat was unrelenting, and the overseers' whips left trails of pain across their skin. The sugar mills, or engin hoes, were places of industry and despair. The machinery groaned as it processed the cane, the smell of molasses thick in the air. Fires roared in the boilers, fueled by the wood that was cut from Brazil's forests. The overseers shouted orders, their voices harsh and unyielding. For the enslaved, there was no rest, no reprieve. Only the promise of another day just like the one before. Yet even in the depths of suffering, there were sparks of resilience. The enslaved carried their culture with them across the ocean, like seeds waiting to take root. Their songs, filled with sorrow and defiance, echoed across the fields. They whispered stories of their homelands, memories that refused to fade despite the distance. In the darkness of the night, they danced, their movements a quiet rebellion, a reminder of who they were and where they came from. The plantations were more than places of labor, they were theaters of power and resistance. The enslaved found ways to push back, however small. They worked slower, sabotaged equipment, or escaped into the forests, seeking refuge in hidden communities known as quilombos. These settlements, founded by those who refused to accept their chains, became symbols of freedom. Quilombo dos Palmares, one of the largest, stood as a beacon of hope and defiance for decades. The sugar economy reshaped Brazil and the Atlantic world. It drew merchants, traders, and investors from Europe, creating a vast network of wealth built on the backs of the enslaved. Ships filled with sugar left Brazil's ports, their holds brimming with sweetness destined for distant markets. But with every shipment came a silent cost, human lives reduced to commodities, their stories erased in the pursuit of profit. The plantation owners grew rich, their wealth reflected in grand houses and lavish lifestyles. They held power, not just over the land, but over the lives of those who worked it. They dined on imported delicacies, their tables heavy with food and wine, while the enslaved fought to survive on scraps. The contrast was stark, a divide as wide as the ocean that had brought them to this place. In the towns and cities, the echoes of the sugar economy were everywhere. Markets bustled with goods brought in by enslaved porters, their feet bare against the cobblestones. Taverns rang with the laughter of merchants who toasted their fortunes, while in the shadows, the enslaved carried their burdens silently. The wealth created by sugar touched every corner of society, yet it was built on a foundation of unimaginable suffering. The scars of this time lingered not just in the land, but in the hearts of the people. The enslaved who labored under the sun, the indigenous whose worlds were upended, the Africans whose lives were stolen, all bore the weight of a system that valued sugar more than human life. Their pain was etched into the fields, the mills, and the very soil of Brazil, a reminder of the cost of sweetness. And yet, amidst the darkness, there were glimmers of humanity. Bonds were forged between those who suffered together, connections that transcended the chains. Enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples shared knowledge, culture, and resilience, creating a new, blended identity that would shape Brazil's future. The land, though scarred, held the echoes of their strength, their courage, and their refusal to be erased. The sky over Recife was heavy with smoke, the air thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and burning wood. The cries of battle echoed through the streets, mingling with the clash of steel and the dull thud of cannon fire. Beneath the relentless sun, the waters of the Atlantic glimmered with an almost cruel indifference, carrying the Dutch ships that loomed on the horizon like predators circling their prey. For decades, Brazil had been the jewel in Portugal's colonial crown, its sugar wealth flowing across the Atlantic to fill the coffers of Lisbon. But now, that wealth had drawn the eyes of another power. The Dutch, determined to carve their place in the New World, arrived with ships bristling with cannons and soldiers driven by ambition. They didn't come as explorers or traders. They came as conquerors. In 1624, the city of Salvador, the capital of colonial Brazil, woke to the sound of cannon fire. The Dutch fleet, sleek and menacing, bore down on the city's defenses with ruthless precision. The walls trembled as the invaders stormed ashore, their red and orange flags snapping in the wind. The Portuguese defenders fought valiantly, their muskets cracking through the chaos, but they were outmatched. Within days, Salvador fell, its streets echoing with the sound of foreign voices. The Dutch victory was short-lived. Portuguese forces, supported by Spain under the Iberian Union, rallied quickly. A powerful armada sailed from Europe, retaking Salvador and driving the invaders back to their ships. The city, battered but unbroken, stood as a testament to Portuguese resilience. But this was only the beginning. The Dutch had tasted the wealth of Brazil, and they would return. In 1630, the Dutch launched a new assault, this time targeting Pernambuco in the northeast, the heart of Brazil's sugar production. Recife, a bustling port city, became the center of their campaign. The invasion was swift and brutal. The Dutch East India Company, armed with mercenaries and advanced military strategies, seized control of the region. Plantations were taken, and the sugar mills, the engines of Brazil's economy, fell into Dutch hands. For years, Pernambuco was a land of uneasy occupation. The Dutch, led by Johan Moritz of Nassau, established a government that sought to stabilize the region. They introduced reforms, built infrastructure, and even extended a degree of religious tolerance. But beneath this facade of order, resentment simmered. The Portuguese settlers, fiercely loyal to their homeland, bristled under foreign rule. Enslaved Africans and indigenous people, already burdened by the yoke of colonial oppression, found themselves caught in the crossfire of European powers. Resistance was inevitable. Bands of Portuguese loyalists took to the countryside, striking back at the Dutch in swift, guerrilla-style attacks. They were joined by enslaved Africans seeking freedom and indigenous warriors fighting to defend their lands. Together, these disparate groups formed a resistance that was as diverse as Brazil itself. Their battles were fought in the shadows of sugarcane fields and the dense thickets of the Atlantic forest, their movements hidden beneath the cover of night. One name stood out among the resistance, Francisco Barreto de Menezes, a leader whose determination became a rallying cry. Under his guidance, the Portuguese forces launched a campaign to reclaim the Northeast. The fighting was brutal, the losses heavy on both sides. Cities were reduced to rubble, plantations burned, and lives were consumed by the relentless march of war. The decisive moment came in 1645 with the outbreak of the Luso-Brazilian insurrection. The rebellion, fueled by years of frustration and the unyielding desire for freedom, swept across Pernambuco. Portuguese forces, bolstered by local fighters, struck at the heart of Dutch control. The Battle of Guararapes, fought in 1648 and again in 1649, became a symbol of this struggle. On the rolling hills of Guararapes, under a sky darkened by smoke, the Portuguese and their allies clashed with the Dutch in a ferocious confrontation. The battlefield was a cacophony of noise, the roar of cannons, the clash of swords, the cries of the wounded. Soldiers fell to the ground, their blood soaking into the earth they fought to claim. But amidst the chaos, the Portuguese forces held firm. Their unity, forged in the fires of adversity, proved stronger than the Dutch lines. The victories at Guararapes turned the tide of the war, marking the beginning of the end for the Dutch occupation. By 1654, the Dutch presence in Brazil crumbled. Recife, the stronghold that had once symbolized their ambitions, was retaken. The Portuguese forces, weary but triumphant, raised their flag over the city once more. The Dutch ships, their hulls battered and their ambitions thwarted, disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind the scars of 2 decades of conflict. The battles had left a mark not just on the land, but on its people. Lives were lost, families torn apart, and communities uprooted. But through the fire of war, a sense of identity began to emerge. The resistance against the Dutch had brought together people from different backgrounds, Portuguese settlers, enslaved Africans, and indigenous Brazilians, uniting them in a shared cause. The echoes of their struggle would linger, a reminder of what it meant to fight for the soul of a land that refused to be subdued. The sound of drums echoed through the dense forest, their rhythm steady and ancient, carrying with it the stories of a people who had lived in harmony with this land for centuries. Around a fire, figures moved in a hypnotic dance, their faces painted with the symbols of their ancestors, their voices lifted in chants that seemed to rise to the stars themselves. The forest, alive with its own music of rustling leaves and distant animal calls, stood as witness to a sacred connection, a bond between the earth, the spirits, and the people. Into this world stepped strangers with pale faces and foreign tongues. Their arrival was heralded not by drums, but by the tolling of bells, their symbols not of nature, but of a crucifix held high against the sun. These were the Jesuits, men who carried not weapons but words, their mission driven by faith and an unshakable belief in their purpose. They saw the land as untamed and its people as souls to be saved, their traditions painted as darkness to be illuminated by the light of God. The Jesuits began their work with fervor. They built missions, imposing structures of wood and stone that stood as outposts of a new order. These missions became the heart of their efforts, places where indigenous communities were gathered, baptized, and taught the ways of the church. The Jesuits spoke of salvation, of a world beyond this one, promising eternal peace in exchange for the abandonment of old ways. For many indigenous people, the words of the Jesuits were both confusing and frightening. Their stories of sin and salvation clashed with the deep-rooted beliefs that had guided their ancestors for generations. At first, some indigenous groups embraced the Jesuits, drawn by their compassion and their gifts of tools, food, and protection from enslavers. The missions offered a semblance of security in a world that was rapidly changing, where the arrival of Europeans brought not just new customs, but also disease, war, and destruction. For others, however, the missions represented a threat to everything they held dear, a forced reshaping of their identity, a demand to let go of the spirits that had guided them and the ceremonies that had defined their lives. The Jesuits worked tirelessly, learning the languages of the people they sought to convert, translating the Bible into indigenous tongues, and teaching children the prayers and rituals of Catholicism. They baptized thousands, marking each as a soul saved for Christ. But this spiritual colonization came with a price. The rituals of the indigenous were deemed heretical, their sacred objects destroyed, their dances silenced. In the eyes of the church, there was no room for the gods of the forest or the ancestors whose whispers were carried on the wind. The missions grew, becoming more than places of worship. They were centers of education, labor, and governance, imposing a new structure on the lives of those within. The Jesuits taught European farming techniques, introduced new crops, and organized communal labor. But this new way of life often felt alien to those who had once lived in harmony with the rhythms of the natural world. The forests, rivers, and skies, once sources of spiritual connection, were now seen as resources to be tamed and exploited. Conflict was inevitable. Indigenous leaders, guardians of their people's traditions, resisted the Jesuits' efforts to reshape their communities. They spoke of the spirits who would be angered by the abandonment of sacred rites, warning of consequences that would ripple through the land. Some tribes fled into the depths of the forest, choosing exile over submission. Others fought back, their weapons no match for the firepower of the colonizers, but wielded with a determination born of desperation. The Jesuits, too, faced challenges from within the colonial system. Their protection of indigenous people from enslavement angered plantation owners and settlers who saw the missions as obstacles to their ambitions. The Jesuits' insistence on treating the indigenous as children of God, deserving of dignity and respect, clashed with the brutal realities of the slave-driven economy. Tensions between the Jesuits and colonial authorities simmered, occasionally erupting into open conflict. Despite the resistance, the Jesuits pressed on, driven by their vision of a Christian Brazil. Their methods were often paternalistic, their certainty in their mission unwavering. Yet there were moments of genuine connection, instances where Jesuits and indigenous people found common ground. Some Jesuits grew to respect the wisdom of the people they sought to convert, learning from their knowledge of the land and incorporating elements of their culture into the practices of the missions. These moments, fleeting as they were, stood as a testament to the possibility of understanding amid the forces of change. But for many indigenous communities, the cost was devastating. Their languages began to fade, their stories replaced by the narratives of the Bible. Their gods, once vibrant and alive, became whispers, remembered only in secret. The missions, though they offered safety from enslavement, also became prisons of a different kind, a place where autonomy was surrendered and the ties to a rich and ancient heritage were severed. The bells of the missions rang out over the land, their sound carrying a message of transformation that would leave no one untouched. The Jesuits believed they were saving souls, bringing light to a land they saw as dark. But for the indigenous people, the light often burned too brightly, casting long shadows over the lives they had once known. And yet, in the quiet corners of the forest, in the hearts of those who remembered, the old ways lingered, waiting for a time when they might rise again. The first glint of gold shimmered in the shallow stream, catching the sunlight and the breath of the man who spotted it. Kneeling in the cool waters, his heart raced as he held the tiny fragment of metal, its promise of unimaginable wealth dancing before his eyes. This was more than a discovery, it was a revelation that would set entire worlds into motion. Word spread like wildfire, carried on the lips of dreamers and schemers alike, and soon, the once quiet hills of Minas Gerais came alive with the relentless sound of picks and shovels, echoing through the valleys. The rush began as men from all corners of Brazil and beyond poured into the region, driven by hope, greed, and desperation. Some came with dreams of fortune, others with little more than their bare hands and the will to survive. They trudged through dense forests and rugged terrain, enduring scorching days and freezing nights, chasing the whisper of gold hidden beneath the earth. For many, the journey itself was perilous, a test of endurance that claimed lives before the mines even came into view. Streams became battlegrounds as prospectors fought for every grain of gold they could sift from the water. Entire families uprooted their lives, setting up makeshift camps along the rivers and hillsides, their tents fluttering in the wind like fragile hopes. The air was thick with tension, charged by the dreams of riches that could transform peasants into kings and the knowledge that failure was just as likely. The goldfields were a place of stark contrasts, where fortunes could be made or lost in a single stroke of luck. Some struck veins so rich that their wildest imaginings became reality, while others worked themselves to exhaustion only to find the earth yielding nothing but dirt. The discovery of diamonds added a new intensity to the frenzy. The stones, glittering like fragments of the stars, turned miners into treasure hunters, their eyes scanning every rock and crevice with feverish determination. As gold and diamonds flowed from the hills, so too did life begin to transform the region. Small encampments grew into bustling towns, their streets crowded with traders, miners, and merchants seeking to capitalize on the rush. Ouro Preto emerged as the heart of this new world, its cobblestone streets winding through hills dotted with ornate churches and grand colonial buildings. The town's name, Black Gold, was a testament to the wealth it held, a wealth that would forever shape the destiny of Brazil. The towns that rose from the dust were alive with contrast. On one side, there was opulence, mansions adorned with European luxury, their owners feasting on delicacies imported from across the seas. The churches stood as monuments to faith and fortune, their gilded altars shimmering with gold mined from the hills. On the other side, there was hardship, the miners who toiled endlessly, their hands raw and their lungs choked with dust. Enslaved Africans, torn from their homelands, bore the heaviest burdens, their sweat and suffering fueling the wealth of others. The streets buzzed with activity, a blend of languages and cultures converging in a chaotic symphony. The clang of blacksmiths' hammers mingled with the melodies of street musicians. Markets overflowed with goods, from local produce to luxuries brought on ships from Europe and Africa. Yet beneath the lively surface, there was an unshakable tension, a sense that the wealth of the mines came at a cost too great to ignore. The relentless extraction of gold and diamonds carved scars into the land, the hills stripped of their greenery and the rivers polluted with silt and waste. The once pristine beauty of Minas Gerais became a landscape marked by human ambition and greed. The toll on the people was just as severe. Miners labored under brutal conditions, their bodies worn by the unyielding demands of the earth. Enslaved workers bore the weight of their chains and the crushing reality of a life stolen from them. Yet, even amidst the harshness, life persisted. Families found ways to celebrate, to hold on to their traditions, and to carve out moments of joy in the shadow of the mines. Music and dance filled the nights, the rhythm of drums and the strumming of guitars creating a connection to something greater than gold, a sense of humanity that could not be erased by the lure of wealth. The towns of Minas Gerais became more than centers of extraction, they became places where ideas were exchanged, where cultures mingled and evolved. The wealth of the region supported the arts, funding the creation of masterpieces that would endure long after the mines ran dry. Churches became canvases for the likes of Elijah Dinho, whose sculptures and designs infused European forms with a distinctly Brazilian soul. The gold rush was a force that reshaped Brazil, pulling it into the orbit of global trade and power. Ships laden with treasures sailed across the Atlantic, their holds filled with the riches of Minas Gerais. The wealth fueled the ambitions of the Portuguese crown, financing wars, palaces, and colonial expansions. Yet, even as the riches flowed outward, the people who lived and worked in the shadows of the mines bore the weight of a system that valued gold more than lives. As the veins of gold and the fields of diamonds began to wane, the towns they had built endured. Their streets, once filled with the frenzy of prospectors, became quieter, their buildings weathered by time but still standing as a testament to an era that changed the course of a nation. And beneath the hills, where the picks and shovels had long since fallen silent, the land began to reclaim its scars, its silence holding the echoes of the lives and dreams that had been poured into its soil. The night was heavy with anticipation, the air filled with a charged stillness. Beneath the soft glow of oil lamps, men gathered in secrecy, their whispers filled with the language of dreams and defiance. They spoke of a land free from the crushing weight of taxes, free from the distant crown that took so much yet gave so little in return. Their eyes burned with the kind of fire only injustice can ignite, a quiet yet unrelenting flame that would not be extinguished. These were the voices of the Inconfidência Mineira, a clandestine movement born in the hills of Minas Gerais. Their leader, a man whose name would echo through history, Joaquim José de Silva Xavier, known simply as Tiradentes, was not a nobleman nor a scholar. He was a dentist, a soldier, and a dreamer, a man who believed that the oppressive hand of Portugal could be resisted, that Brazil could rise and shape its own destiny. His words, impassioned and raw, inspired hope among the weary, though the path he proposed was fraught with danger. At the heart of their grievances was the quinto, the brutal tax that demanded a fifth of all gold mined be sent to the crown. Even as the mines began to yield less, the demands did not waver. Farmers, miners, and merchants alike felt the sting of this unyielding system. Roads became lifelines for gold convoys under heavy guard, each shipment a reminder of a nation's wealth siphoned away to a distant land. The cries of the people, drowned in the echoes of the crown's decrees, grew louder in their silence, waiting for someone brave enough to give them a voice. The conspirators, drawn from the educated and the ambitious, spoke in hushed tones of liberty and equality, ideas that had traveled across oceans, carried by whispers of revolution in the Americas and Europe. They dreamed of a Brazil untethered from the yoke of colonialism, where the fruits of the land would nourish its own people, not feed the coffers of a king an ocean away. Maps were sketched, alliances sought, and plans forged, all under the cover of darkness, where courage and trepidation walked hand in hand. But freedom was a perilous gamble, and the stakes were high. The conspirators knew that betrayal could unravel their cause, that the cost of failure would be death, not just for them, but for their families, their friends, their communities. Trust was a precious currency, one that grew thinner with each passing day. Eyes darted nervously in the shadows, searching for signs of treachery, for the cracks that could bring their fragile hope crumbling down. As their plans took shape, the colonial authorities remained oblivious, their focus fixed on the steady flow of wealth from the land. But it would not last. A whisper in the wrong ear, a careless word spoken in confidence, and the conspiracy was exposed. The arrests were swift and merciless, the dreams of rebellion crushed under the iron heel of the crown. Tiradentes stood alone as the symbol of the movement, the scapegoat for an uprising that had yet to bloom. His trial was a spectacle, designed not for justice but for deterrence. He stood before his accusers, unbowed, a man whose spirit had not been broken. The sentence was harsh, but it was not unexpected. Death by hanging, his body to be quartered and displayed as a warning to others who might dare to defy the crown. The execution was a grim affair, a public spectacle meant to instill fear. Yet, in that moment, Tiradentes became more than a man. He became a symbol of resistance, a martyr whose sacrifice would linger in the hearts of a people yearning for freedom. His death did not extinguish the flame, it fanned it, his name whispered in defiance, his memory a rallying cry for those who would come after. The seeds of rebellion planted in the hills of Minas Gerais began to sprout, watered by the blood and tears of those who dared to imagine a different future. The tensions between the colonial authorities and the local elites grew sharper as the crown's grip tightened in the face of unrest. Each decree, each tax, each act of repression only served to widen the rift, to deepen the longing for independence. In the salons of the wealthy and the workshops of the poor, voices began to rise. The ideas that had seemed distant and dangerous began to take root in everyday conversations, the vision of a free Brazil spreading like the rivers that carved through its lands. The ground was shifting, imperceptibly but inexorably, beneath the weight of colonial rule. And so, the story of rebellion was not ended by the gallows. It was only beginning, written in the hearts of a people who had seen the possibility of something greater, something worth fighting for. The echoes of those early whispers, carried on the winds of change, would reach every corner of the land, igniting a fire that no force could suppress. The river was wide, its waters heavy with the weight of history. As the sun rose over Rio de Janeiro in 1822, its rays cast a golden light over the city, but beneath the gleam, uncertainty gripped the hearts of the people. The air was thick with tension, and the streets buzzed with rumors and whispers of a future uncharted. It was in this fragile moment that Dom Pedro I, the heir to the Portuguese throne, stood at a crossroads, not just between two lands, but between two worlds. Independencia ou morte. The cry rang out, sharp and defiant, as Dom Pedro, standing on the banks of the Ipiranga River, made a decision that would echo for centuries. The decision was sudden, a spark that ignited the birth of a new nation, Brazil. His proclamation, independence or death, was not just a cry of freedom from Portugal, it was a cry for something greater. It was a cry that would carve the soul of Brazil into something fierce and untamed, something that could never again be bound to the shackles of its colonial past. Dom Pedro had been living in a land caught between two worlds, torn between loyalties to his mother country, Portugal, and the yearning of the Brazilian people for self-determination. For years, he had been part of the delicate dance of colonial politics, torn between his duty as a son and his responsibility as a leader in a land that was beginning to see itself as something more. But the cries for freedom had grown too loud to ignore, and the moment had arrived. The weight of a crown that was once his to inherit now seemed too heavy to bear. And in that moment of decision, as he gazed out at the river, something within him shifted. He knew that this would not just be a fight for freedom, it would be a fight to shape a new future, to define the very identity of a people whose blood and spirit were intertwined with the land they called home. The Declaration of Independence was not an easy victory. It was not the thunderous roar of triumph, but the quiet, painful realization that a country was born from the broken pieces of an empire. The challenges of creating a unified nation were immense, with the weight of centuries of colonialism bearing down on the shoulders of the fledgling Brazilian state. Brazil was vast, its people divided by geography, culture, and language. There were the Portuguese-speaking elites, the indigenous people who had survived centuries of brutality, and the African slaves whose labor had built the very foundation of the colony. Each group carried its own dreams, its own wounds, and its own vision of what independence could mean. In the days following the declaration, Dom Pedro was thrust into a whirlwind of political intrigue, military battles, and fractured alliances. He was crowned the first emperor of Brazil, a title that, for all its grandeur, could not shield him from the enormous task before him. How could a man who had once been a prince in a distant court now unite a nation of diverse peoples, each with its own struggles, its own history? How could he bring together a land so vast, so rich in contradictions, that to hold it together would take every ounce of strength and wisdom he could muster? For Dom Pedro, the struggle was not just with foreign powers, but with the very nature of Brazil itself. The heart of the nation beat in every corner, from the sugar plantations to the mountain villages, from the great cities to the forests where indigenous tribes lived. It was a land of contradiction, where beauty and brutality coexisted in a delicate balance, where old wounds bled openly and new hopes began to blossom. Dom Pedro's vision was noble. He dreamed of a Brazil that would not only be free from Portuguese rule, but one that would be a beacon of strength and unity. Yet the empire he inherited was fragile. The forces of independence did not always align with the vision of a unified nation. While some sought freedom, others sought power, and the bonds of loyalty were tested again and again. There were rebellions and uprisings, bloody skirmishes between factions that saw the birth of Brazil not as a triumph, but as a battleground for control. The land was as divided as its people. In the north, the sugar plantations flourished, their wealth built on the backs of enslaved Africans. In the south, the cattle ranches and small towns whispered of a life that was far from the imperial courts of Rio de Janeiro. Each region carried its own identity, its own needs, and its own sense of belonging. Dom Pedro had inherited an empire that was not one nation, but many. His challenge was not simply to keep the pieces from falling apart, but to weave them together into something that could stand as one. In those early days of independence, there were moments when the crown seemed more a burden than a symbol of unity. There were moments when Dom Pedro questioned his ability to hold the empire together. Yet through every struggle, through every setback, there was something more that drove him forward, a quiet, unwavering belief that the dream of a united Brazil was worth every sacrifice. The struggles of those who fought for independence, the tears of mothers who lost sons, and the suffering of those who had endured centuries of hardship weighed on his heart, urging him to build something that would give them all a place in the future. Despite the challenges, despite the bloodshed and the betrayals, Brazil slowly began to take shape. The people who had once been subjects of a foreign crown were now citizens of a nation, bound together by the idea of Brazil. But as the nation began to find its feet, the road ahead remained steep. Dom Pedro, though emperor, was not a king, and the crown he wore was a fragile one. His reign would be marked by battles, both external and internal, struggles that would test his vision for the nation. The independence of Brazil was not a singular moment of triumph. It was a long, difficult process, a struggle that would continue for generations. It was a story of a young emperor, thrust into a new role, struggling to define his place in a land that was still finding its identity. It was a story of a nation born from the wounds of colonialism, a nation that would rise not through the strength of one man, but through the hopes and dreams of its people. And as Dom Pedro looked out across the land he had declared free, he knew that the journey was just beginning. Dom Pedro sat in his grand chair, the weight of the crown heavy on his brow. The room around him was silent, except for the faint rustling of papers and the soft creak of the wooden floorboards beneath his feet. He looked out the window, his gaze lost in the expanse of the Brazilian landscape, a vast land filled with both promise and peril. He had once stood on the banks of the Ipiranga River, declaring Brazil's independence, but now, as the first emperor of Brazil, the responsibility he faced was even greater. The land was free, but it was broken, fragile, and deeply divided. His dream of a unified nation was slipping away as the cracks of his empire began to show. Building a nation from the ruins of colonialism was no easy feat for Dom Pedro. The challenges were endless. Brazil was young, and though it had won its independence, it had not yet found its soul. It was a land filled with contradictions. The wealthy Portuguese elite, who had once ruled over Brazil, now found themselves uncertain about their place in this new world. The powerful landowners in the south, the sugar plantation aristocrats in the northeast, and the vast populations of enslaved Africans all pulled at the fabric of the empire, each group vying for their own voice in the national chorus. For Dom Pedro, the task of weaving those voices into a single, united nation seemed impossible. The monarchy was an untested system in the Americas, and Dom Pedro knew it. His reign was not just about ruling a country, it was about creating something new, a nation that had never existed before. There were moments of great ambition, where Dom Pedro dreamed of Brazil becoming a strong, influential empire. But there were also moments of doubt. The Brazilian people had never known an emperor, and many were suspicious of the very idea of monarchy. The shadow of Portugal still loomed large, with some Brazilians questioning whether they had truly escaped the chains of their colonial past. Would they ever truly be free, or would they be ruled by a new, distant monarch, no different from the one they had fought so hard to escape? Dom Pedro's first years as emperor were marked by tension both within Brazil and beyond its borders. Dom Pedro had to convince not only his people but also foreign nations that Brazil could stand on its own. He sought to establish trade agreements, form alliances, and maintain Brazil's hard-won independence on the international stage. But Europe, especially Portugal, was far from pleased. The Old World was reluctant to let go of its grasp on its former colony, and Dom Pedro felt the sting of betrayal at every turn. He fought for recognition, for the respect of the world, but each victory seemed bittersweet. He could never forget that the very land he now ruled had once been the possession of another empire, and the scars of that history never healed. Internally, Dom Pedro's reign was a struggle for legitimacy. The political scene was a whirlwind of shifting alliances and power plays. Brazil had no true aristocracy, no long-established elite to support his rule. Many of the influential figures in Brazil came from the landowning class or the military, men who had earned their status through the struggle for independence. But loyalty to Dom Pedro was not guaranteed. Some of them, perhaps even more than he realized, were motivated by their own ambitions. For all his dreams of a strong and united Brazil, Dom Pedro found himself caught in the web of competing interests and divided loyalties. The social divisions within Brazil were stark. There were the wealthy landowners who wanted to protect their privileges and the countless others who lived in poverty, their lives marked by the brutal reality of slavery. Slavery, though abolished in parts of the world, remained firmly entrenched in Brazil. It was the backbone of Brazil's economy, particularly in the sugar and coffee plantations. Dom Pedro's attempts at reform were met with resistance, and many feared that the emperor's desire for a stronger, more unified Brazil would come at the expense of their deeply ingrained privileges. As Dom Pedro struggled to bring order to Brazil, his own personal life began to unravel. The pressures of ruling a new empire weighed on him, and his marriage to Maria Leopoldina, an Austrian archduchess, was tested by the demands of the throne. They had children together, but the emotional distance between them grew. Dom Pedro found solace in the company of other women, further straining his already fragile domestic life. The emperor's personal life became a reflection of the instability of the empire, torn between conflicting loyalties, between duty and desire, between what was and what could be. Dom Pedro's reign was also marked by a series of revolts and uprisings. The internal struggles of the nation came to a head in the form of popular uprisings against his rule. In the southern regions, the people rebelled, seeking more autonomy and even independence from Brazil. Dom Pedro had to face the terrifying reality that his empire could fracture, and despite his best efforts, the central authority of the monarchy was continually challenged by local leaders. The fires of rebellion spread across the land, and in his heart, Dom Pedro could feel the struggle between his vision for a unified Brazil and the harsh reality of a fractured empire. Every revolt, every protest, was a reminder of the immense distance between the Brazil of his dreams and the Brazil that existed before him. In his later years, Dom Pedro's vision of a grand Brazilian empire began to slip further from his grasp. His once strong leadership faltered as political unrest and personal scandal took their toll. He struggled to keep control of his empire, even as his health declined. The weight of the crown, which had once felt like a symbol of destiny, now seemed like a burden too great to bear. His reign was marked by moments of brilliance, but also by moments of failure and frustration. By the time he abdicated the throne in 1831, Dom Pedro had achieved something remarkable, though not what he had imagined. He had built a nation from the ashes of colonialism, and in doing so, had helped lay the foundation for the Brazil that would emerge in the years to come. But the empire he had dreamed of was never fully realized. His struggles were not in vain, for his reign had set Brazil on a path that would ultimately lead to greater freedom, though not without sacrifice and pain. The story of Dom Pedro is not one of a flawless ruler or an empire that flourished without difficulty. It is the story of a man whose hopes and dreams were woven into the fabric of a young nation, a man who faced unimaginable challenges and who, in the end, was forced to step away from the throne he had fought so hard to claim. His reign was a story of highs and lows, of battles won and lost, and of a nation struggling to define itself in a world that was constantly changing. The grand hall of the imperial palace was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, its walls adorned with portraits of those who had come before. At the center of it all, Dom Pedro II sat alone, a figure whose presence seemed too heavy for the youth of his years. He was only 14 when he became emperor, a boy thrust into a world of power and expectation. And yet, despite the weight of the crown on his young head, there was something in his eyes that seemed far older, something that understood the price of leadership in a country torn by division. His reign was to be a long one, and the story of Brazil under Dom Pedro II is one of both brilliance and sorrow, of progress and struggle. His empire, though still young, had a heart that beat with ambition. As the country began to modernize, there was a glimmer of hope. Railroads stretched across the land, connecting Brazil in ways it had never been before. Cities began to swell with people who sought opportunities in the changing world, as factories and businesses rose like monuments to progress. The arts flourished, too. Literature, music, and theater became the voice of a nation finding its soul. The imperial court, once a place of distant dreams, now seemed to shimmer with possibility. Dom Pedro II surrounded himself with the best minds of his time, inviting artists, scientists, and intellectuals to Brazil. He himself was a man of learning, a scholar who believed that knowledge was the key to building a strong nation. But despite the outward splendor, the palace walls could not shut out the cracks that ran deep through the country. For while industrialization spread its wings, it was built on a foundation that remained broken: slavery. Brazil, despite its progress, still held tight to the chains of its past. The empire was built on the backs of those who were forced into slavery, and the black people who toiled in the fields were the silent engine of its growth. The wealth of Brazil was inextricably tied to the labor of those who had no voice. And though Dom Pedro II saw the shining future of Brazil, he was unable to escape the shadow of that dark past. The tensions in Brazil during Dom Pedro II's reign were palpable. On one hand, the country was opening its doors to the world, welcoming industrial progress and modernity. On the other, it was shackled by its reliance on slavery. The gulf between the rich and the poor widened, and the landowners, the powerful elite, clung to the system that had made them prosperous. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The winds of change were blowing in from every corner of the empire. It was in these years that the abolitionist movement began to rise in strength, calling for the freedom of those enslaved, for the end of a practice that had been part of Brazil's identity for centuries. The echoes of this movement resonated through the cities, stirring hearts and igniting minds. There were protests, speeches, and marches. The enslaved people, though silenced by their chains, found ways to speak through their struggle. Their fight for freedom was relentless, and it was in their voices that the heart of Brazil beat the loudest. But Dom Pedro II, for all his wisdom and progress, found himself caught between the demands of his people and the old order that had given Brazil its wealth. He was a man who believed in justice and in the power of reason, but he also knew that the changes the abolitionists demanded would shake the foundations of the empire. The question hung in the air like a storm cloud: how could a nation built on slavery become a nation of equality and justice? And would the emperor, the very symbol of the monarchy, be able to weather the storm? The golden age of Dom Pedro II's reign was also a time of deep contradiction. While the country advanced in some ways, it faltered in others. Brazil became a land of stark contrasts. Modern cities stood next to sprawling plantations, and wealthy families lived side by side with those who had nothing. The very progress that Brazil celebrated was built upon an economic system that dehumanized millions of people. And in the midst of it all, the emperor walked a delicate line between preservation and transformation. Dom Pedro II tried to lead with compassion and wisdom, but his reign was not free from hardship. Political instability, economic struggles, and a growing desire for change from the people made his position ever more difficult. While the intellectuals, the artists, and the elites dreamed of a new Brazil, the masses cried out for justice. In his heart, the emperor knew that change was inevitable. But how could he navigate a world where every step forward was met with resistance? The slavery question was the most pressing of all. Dom Pedro II's government took steps toward gradual abolition, but the resistance was fierce. For the landowners, slavery was the bedrock of their wealth, and they fought to keep it intact. Every day, the emperor was forced to make decisions that tore at the very soul of the nation. He knew that Brazil could never truly prosper without freeing its people, but how could he dismantle a system that was so deeply embedded in the country's fabric? Throughout these years, as Brazil grappled with the questions of progress and justice, Dom Pedro II remained steadfast in his belief that Brazil could rise as a modern, thriving nation. He traveled the world, seeking inspiration, learning from other countries, and bringing ideas back to Brazil. But the pressure of holding an empire together, the weight of history pressing down on him, became too great. His own health began to falter, and the young emperor's once strong resolve started to weaken. Despite the political and social tensions, there were moments when the nation seemed to gleam with hope. The abolition of slavery, which had been a dream for so long, finally came in 1888 with the signing of the Lei Áurea, the Golden Law. It was a victory for the abolitionists, for the enslaved people, and for the country. But it was also the beginning of the end for the empire. The monarchy that had once seemed so stable was now fractured, torn apart by the very changes it had struggled to navigate. The golden age of Dom Pedro II was not one of flawless triumph, but of a nation in the midst of transformation. Brazil stood at a crossroads, a land of promise and contradiction, of beauty and pain. And though the emperor had strived to build a strong, united Brazil, his reign ended with the monarchy's fall, leaving behind a nation that was still searching for its true identity. The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting its harsh light on the streets of Rio de Janeiro. Amidst the bustling market, the whispers of change rippled through the crowd like the wind through the trees. For decades, Brazil had lived in the shadow of its past, a past built on the backs of millions. The lives of countless people whose names were forgotten by history, had been sacrificed for the wealth of the few. But the air was thick with something else now, something that hadn't been there before. It was hope. And it was moving like a river, unstoppable, sweeping through the empire in waves. It was the late 1880s, and the whispers had grown louder. In the streets, in the crowded cafes, in the halls of power, there was talk of a new future for Brazil. A future where the chains of slavery would finally be broken. For too long, the country had been shackled by its own history, tied to a cruel system that turned human beings into property. But now, that future was coming closer. Joaquim Nabuco, with his quiet determination, had long fought for this moment. The sound of his voice in the chambers of Parliament had been the voice of reason, of justice. For years, he had written, spoken, and campaigned tirelessly for the abolition of slavery. His words carried weight, but they were often met with resistance, for the system of slavery was deeply entrenched in the fabric of Brazilian society. Many feared that abolishing slavery would destroy the economy, dismantle the foundations of the landowner's wealth. But Nabuco had never faltered. He knew what was at stake, the dignity of a people who had been enslaved for generations. And then there was André Reboucas, a man whose contributions were just as vital, yet whose name is often less remembered. Reboucas, an engineer and abolitionist, worked tirelessly behind the scenes, pushing for practical reforms that would allow Brazil to transition from its dependence on slavery to a more just, modern society. He understood that ending slavery wasn't just a moral issue, it was a question of survival for the future of Brazil. The nation was changing, and the economy would need to adapt. But it wasn't just about economics. It was about the souls of the people who had been held in bondage, the families torn apart, the generations lost in a system that had treated them as less than human. In 1888, Brazil found itself at the precipice of history. The Lei Áurea, the Golden Law, was signed, finally declaring the abolition of slavery. There were no more chains. No more auctions. No more forced labor. It was the end of an era that had defined Brazil for centuries. For the enslaved, it was a moment of unimaginable joy. The chains were gone, but what was left? They had been denied the ability to own land, to make choices, to live without fear. Their bodies had been used and abused, their lives stripped of their dignity. Now, they were free, but what did that freedom mean in a country still divided by class and race? As the news of the abolition spread, there were celebrations in the streets. People danced, and the sound of drums echoed through the air. For those who had been freed, it was a moment of profound relief. But beneath the joy was a deep sadness, a grief that could not be so easily washed away. What had been taken from them over the decades, their families, their freedom, their lives, could never be returned. And the scars of slavery ran deep in the veins of Brazil. The country had been forever changed, but the road ahead would not be easy. The landowners, those who had profited from the misery of others, were not all quick to accept this new reality. The wealthy elite, who had once relied on the forced labor of millions to cultivate sugar, coffee, and cotton, were now faced with a new, uncomfortable reality. The system they had built their fortunes on had crumbled, and they were left to navigate a world without slaves. For many of them, it was a crisis. But for the former slaves, it was a triumph, even if it was just the beginning of a long road to true freedom. As the celebrations died down and the streets began to quiet, a stark truth remained: the abolition of slavery was not the end of the struggle for equality. It was only the beginning. Brazil's newly freed citizens would now have to fight not only for their freedom, but for their place in a society that had never seen them as equals. They would have to fight against poverty, racism, and the remnants of a system that had dehumanized them for so long. But in that moment, on the day the Golden Law was signed, there was a glimmer of hope, a hope that, someday, Brazil might become the nation that it had always dreamed of being. Joaquim Nabuco and André Reboucas had fought for this moment, and though the battle was won, they knew the fight for justice would continue. Nabuco, ever the diplomat, worked tirelessly to push for the inclusion of the formerly enslaved in society, understanding that freedom without opportunity was a hollow victory. Reboucas, too, saw the road ahead as one filled with obstacles, but he believed that with time and effort, Brazil could overcome its past. They knew that the struggle for freedom was only the first step on a long path toward equality and unity. The abolition of slavery in Brazil was a pivotal moment, but it was not a perfect one. There was still much to be done. The wounds of the past were not so easily healed, and the legacy of slavery would echo through the generations. But the bravery of those like Nabuco and Reboucas, the courage of those who fought in the streets, in the halls of government, and in the hearts of every Brazilian, showed that change was possible. The end of slavery was not just the end of a system, it was the beginning of a new chapter for Brazil. It was the dawn of a future where the hope for justice and equality could finally take root. In the dead of night, the streets of Rio de Janeiro lay still, as if the city itself held its breath. A whisper spread through the air, one that carried the weight of a nation's future. The empire, long seen as an unshakable symbol of Brazil's glory, was crumbling, like an old monument slowly succumbing to time. The golden age had faded, the promise of a prosperous, united nation now seemed like a distant dream. And in that stillness, the weight of an era's end pressed down on the shoulders of those who had once believed in its power. By 1889, the signs of the empire's decline had been growing for years, but no one could have predicted just how quickly it would all unravel. Dom Pedro II, the beloved emperor who had seen Brazil through years of prosperity and conflict, had become a symbol of a past that no longer fit the new world. The changes in Brazil were undeniable. The Industrial Revolution was sweeping across the globe, and with it came new demands for social and political reform. The empire, once a beacon of stability, was now a fragile house of cards. The economy, though growing in some areas, was increasingly unstable, and the divide between the wealthy elite and the common people had never been more pronounced. As the year 1889 wore on, it became clear that the monarchy had lost the support of many, particularly the military. The military, once loyal to the crown, was now disillusioned with an empire that seemed out of touch with the reality of Brazil's future. A group of officers, hungry for change and ready to reshape the nation, quietly planned their revolt. They were motivated by a mixture of frustration, ambition, and a belief that the monarchy no longer served the people. The growing influence of the military class, combined with the mounting unrest among the common people, had created a storm that no one, not even the emperor, could stop. And so, one fateful morning in November, the sound of marching feet echoed through the streets. Soldiers, led by a young officer named Diodoro de Fonseca, moved swiftly to their positions. The world that Brazil had known for so long was about to be turned upside down. The imperial palace, once a symbol of power and tradition, stood silent as its emperor prepared to face the inevitable. The streets that had once echoed with the cheer of loyal citizens now held only the harsh, sharp sounds of boots on cobblestone. Inside the palace, Dom Pedro II knew the time had come. He had fought for his country, loved his people, and believed in the ideals of his empire. But he understood the changing tides. The loyalty that had once been unwavering was no longer there. As he stood before the mirror, his reflection seemed to stare back at him with a mix of sadness and acceptance. He had hoped for a peaceful transition, but it seemed that history had other plans. And with a heavy heart, he stepped out of the palace to meet the soldiers who had come to bring his reign to an end. The coup was swift, almost too swift for anyone to fully comprehend. In a matter of hours, the empire that had stood for nearly a century was no more. The Brazilian monarchy fell in an instant, its fate sealed by the very people who had once sworn to defend it. Dom Pedro II was exiled to Europe, a man without a throne, and the nation was left to pick up the pieces. In the chaos that followed, a new order emerged. The First Republic was born, but it was a republic built on uncertain foundations. The military, now in control, established a provisional government, but the promise of a democratic future felt distant. The political elite, who had long profited from the monarchy's system, quickly reasserted their influence. The common people, who had been promised a better life, found themselves once again left behind. The fall of the empire was not just the loss of a monarchy, it was the end of a vision. The vision of a united Brazil, ruled by a single family, a family that had, at least in the eyes of some, represented the country's promise. For many, Dom Pedro II had been a symbol of hope. Under his rule, Brazil had experienced moments of progress, even though the shadows of inequality and division remained. But as the empire crumbled, so too did that symbol. What had once been a beacon of unity now seemed fragile, broken by the weight of time and the changing forces of history. The factors leading to the empire's downfall were many, and yet they all pointed to one undeniable truth: the world was changing. The social and political divisions that had festered for so long could no longer be ignored. The empire had failed to adapt, and the people, especially the growing urban and military classes, were ready to create a new order, one where they could have a voice. But in the wake of the empire's collapse, Brazil's future was uncertain. The republic that emerged was not the shining vision of democracy that many had hoped for. It was a republic marked by division, political instability, and the same old elites who had ruled under the monarchy. The military may have seized power, but they had not yet figured out how to unite the country in any meaningful way. The early days of the republic were chaotic, filled with political infighting, military coups, and a fractured nation struggling to define itself. For many, the fall of the empire felt like the end of an era, a time when Brazil could have been something greater, something more united. The promise of a new Brazil, free from the oppression of the old regime, seemed distant. But even in the midst of this uncertainty, the resilience of the Brazilian people shone through. They had endured so much, survived so much, and still, they looked to the future with hope, however dim that hope may have seemed. The fall of the empire was not the end of Brazil's story. It was a turning point, a moment where the country faced the consequences of its history and began to chart a new course. But it was also a painful reminder of how quickly a nation's foundations can crumble. It left behind echoes of what might have been, of a time when a single family could have been the heart of Brazil's unity. And yet, as the First Republic began its uncertain path, the people of Brazil knew that their journey was far from over. The sun blazed down on the vast coffee plantations, casting long shadows over rows of slender trees heavy with ripe fruit. Workers, their backs bent in a rhythm that seemed endless, moved slowly through the fields, their hands stained dark from the fruit they picked. The scent of coffee beans filled the air, rich and strong, as if the earth itself was offering up its wealth. It was here, in the sweat and toil of these fields, that Brazil's fate was being shaped. The country's future hung on the harvest. The fields of coffee, stretching as far as the eye could see, were both a lifeline and a prison, a symbol of the nation's economic might, and the chains that bound it to a system of inequality. Coffee had become the pulse of Brazil, its economy beating in time with the harvests that came year after year. From the dusty hillsides of São Paulo to the fertile plains of Minas Gerais, Brazil's entire landscape was marked by the deep green of coffee trees. The country's reliance on this single export was both a blessing and a curse. The world was thirsty for coffee, and Brazil, with its vast plantations and seemingly endless labor force, was all too happy to supply it. But beneath the surface of Brazil's coffee economy lay a world of unequal power and silent suffering. In the corridors of power, the elites watched as their fortunes grew with every crop that was shipped out of the country. In the cities, the men who held the keys to Brazil's political future lived in palatial homes, surrounded by luxury that came at the cost of the labor of the very people who sustained their wealth. The old republic was born out of this unequal system. A republic where power rested firmly in the hands of a few, and the rest of the population, especially the poor and the laborers, had little say in the direction of the country. The political system of Brazil during the old republic was not built for the common people. It was built for the elites, the wealthy landowners, the coffee barons, and the powerful families who controlled the country's destiny. Behind the facade of republicanism lay a political system dominated by regional rivalries, where power was fiercely guarded, and alliances were made and broken with ruthless efficiency. The game of politics was played not in the open, but in backrooms, where deals were struck and promises made in exchange for control. The country's leaders came from a small group of powerful families, their names etched into the fabric of Brazil's history. The most powerful of these were the coffee elites, men whose fortunes were tied to the land and the labor that sustained it. They formed alliances with one another, each controlling a different region of the country, each fighting to maintain their hold on power. They ruled with a heavy hand, and their power was largely unchecked. The rest of the population, particularly the working class and the former slaves who toiled in the coffee fields, had no voice in the decisions that shaped their lives. But while the elite basked in their wealth, a storm was brewing beneath the surface. The workers, who had long been exploited, began to chafe under the yoke of an economy that offered them nothing more than exhaustion and poverty. The coffee economy was built on their backs, but they saw little of the wealth it created. The oppressive heat of the fields was mirrored by the heat of anger that simmered in their hearts. They had no choice but to endure the hardships, to keep picking the beans that fueled the rich men's fortunes. But inside them, a sense of injustice was growing, one that would eventually boil over. The elites had always feared the power of the people, knowing that without the labor of the workers, the system would collapse. And so, they held on to power with fierce determination. They controlled the vote, used their wealth to buy loyalty, and ensured that anyone who threatened their dominance was silenced. Yet, as the decades wore on, the cracks in the system began to widen. Brazil's political structure, based on regionalism and dominated by a few wealthy men, could not hold forever. The tensions between regions, each vying for more power and resources, began to spill into the open. The government, which had long been a puppet of the coffee elites, struggled to maintain order as more and more Brazilians began to question the system. For the common people, especially those working the coffee fields, the question was not just about politics, it was about survival. With each year, the disparity between the rich and the poor grew more pronounced. The landowners grew wealthier, building their empires with the profits of coffee, while the workers lived in squalor, their lives consumed by the endless cycle of labor. In the fields, they lived in constant fear of losing their jobs, of being replaced by the next wave of workers eager to escape the poverty of their own homes. The brutality of the system was evident in every aspect of life. Workers lived in cramped, unsafe conditions, their lives worth little more than the beans they harvested. And yet, even as the system pressed down on them, the people of Brazil began to stir. The coffee economy had given them little, but it had also given them a sense of shared experience. The same workers who labored in the fields found their voices in the growing movements of the time. They may have had little power, but their collective anger began to shape the political landscape in ways that no one could ignore. And the elites, who had long believed themselves untouchable, began to feel the pressure mounting. The republic, which had been born of their power, was showing signs of strain. The workers, the farmers, and the forgotten people were no longer willing to simply accept their fate. The political power of the elites remained strong, but cracks began to appear in their dominance. The old system of power, based on coffee and regionalism, was no longer sustainable. The elites might have thought they controlled the future, but the future was already beginning to change. The political world of the old republic, once so stable and unyielding, was on the brink of collapse. A new Brazil was stirring, one that would eventually rise out of the old republic's ashes. And so, the old republic continued, with its coffee fields and its politics, its wealthy landowners and its poor laborers. But the storm was coming. The coffee economy, so vital to Brazil's past, could not carry the country forever. The new Brazil, shaped by the voices of the many, would not be silenced for long. The streets of Rio de Janeiro were filled with a hum of energy, the city alive with the hopes and dreams of a nation caught between the past and the future. On the evening of October 24, 1930, the sounds of footsteps echoed through the alleys, but this time, they were different. They were marching. They were determined. This was not just another protest or demonstration, it was the dawn of something new. The old republic, so entrenched in its ways, was about to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Getulio Vargas, a man whose face was barely known to many just months before, stood at the center of it all, a figure emerging from the shadows of political turmoil. A former governor, not yet a legend, but already seen as a beacon of change, Vargas had become the symbol of Brazil's restless spirit. For too long, Brazil had been held captive by the old elites, their power rooted in wealth and tradition, with little care for the struggles of the common people. Vargas was different. He was a promise that change could come, that the country could be shaped into something greater than the sum of its parts. Vargas' rise was swift and brutal. The military coup of 1930 overturned the established order, and with it came a new vision for Brazil, one that would be forged through strength, unity, and sacrifice. The world had watched as the country teetered on the brink, and now, it would see the birth of the Estado Novo, a new era of centralized power under Vargas' iron fist. He understood that the republic, with its fractured regions and corrupt elites, could no longer serve the people. Brazil needed unity, and he was willing to take the necessary steps, no matter the cost, to ensure that it would be achieved. The Estado Novo was not just a political system, it was a revolution. Vargas implemented sweeping changes that touched every corner of Brazilian society. It was as though the country had been given a new heartbeat, pulsing with the promise of industrialization, social reform, and a redefined identity. The factories that once lay dormant began to hum with activity, and the dusty roads that wound through the country's vast countryside now led to cities rising up from the earth. The hum of industry replaced the songs of the land, as Brazil shifted from an agrarian economy to one driven by factories and machines. The sounds of progress were loud, louder than the protests that had once filled the streets. Workers, many of whom had spent their lives in the fields, now found themselves in factories, laboring for a different kind of future. Under Vargas, the idea of a strong, industrialized Brazil began to take shape, and the sense of promise that permeated the air felt palpable. The country, once dependent on coffee and sugar, was learning to stand on its own 2 feet in the global marketplace. The promise of a new Brazil was not just in the gleam of steel and the rise of factories, it was in the lives of those who would work in them, who would become part of the story that was being written. But the road to progress was not without its price. Behind the industrial boom, there was a darker undercurrent of tension. The Estado Novo brought about order, but it also brought control. The fear of dissent, of rebellion against this new world Vargas was crafting, loomed large. Vargas was no Democrat in the conventional sense. His vision for Brazil was one where he would be the guiding hand, and the people would follow. The press was censored, the opposition silenced, and the workers, who had once marched for change, now found themselves marching for something that was dictated to them. In the rush to modernize, Vargas' vision was clear: to build a Brazil that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the industrial powers of the world. But in doing so, he sometimes disregarded the voices of those who had helped bring about the change in the first place. The working class, so vital to the machinery of progress, was also the most vulnerable. The promises of better working conditions, of social equality, were often left unfulfilled, buried beneath the weight of a government eager to consolidate power. Yet, even as they struggled, the workers did not give up. The dream of a better future still burned bright in their hearts, even when their hands were covered in the dust of the factories they had helped to build. Through it all, Vargas' reign was a study in contrasts. He was a man of the people, but he was also a man who understood the power of control. His government built roads and bridges, but it also built walls around dissent. The contradictions of the Vargas era, its promises of progress shadowed by its methods of maintaining power, left Brazil in a constant state of tension, caught between the desire for a better future and the fear of losing the freedoms they had fought for in the past. Yet, despite the struggles, there were moments of brilliance. There were the workers who stood in solidarity, the artists who used their voices to paint a new image of Brazil, and the intellectuals who dared to dream of a better future. In the cities, a new wave of culture emerged, with samba and bossa nova echoing through the streets, a reflection of the hope and resilience of the people. In the universities, young minds debated the path forward, their ideas fueled by the desire to shape a nation that was more than just a footnote in the story of the world. Brazil, with all its flaws, was a nation alive with possibility. It was an era of transformation, one marked by the rise of industry, the echoes of political control, and the unwavering belief that Brazil could become something greater. As the years passed, Vargas' influence began to spread beyond the borders of his government. His vision of a strong, unified Brazil had touched the hearts of many, even as it left others in the shadows. His legacy, shaped by both the successes and the failures of his rule, would live on, etched into the very soul of the nation he had helped to build. But for those who had lived through the tumult of the Vargas era, the true story was written not just in the steel of factories or the iron grip of government, but in the hearts of the people who had fought, struggled, and hoped for a new Brazil. The sudden, deafening silence of the streets in the early hours of April 1, 1964, carried a sense of something far darker than the coming of dawn. It was the calm before the storm, a storm that would sweep across Brazil and leave scars on its soul for decades to come. That morning, with military tanks rolling through the streets, the country was waking up to a new reality. The government had fallen, and a new, terrifying regime had taken its place. A group of generals had seized control, their boots crushing the fragile dreams of democracy underfoot. The military dictatorship had arrived with a promise of stability, but at what cost? For those who lived through it, the years that followed became a blur of fear, repression, and silence. The government, hungry for control, stripped away the very freedoms that had once defined the nation. They censored the press, stifled artists, and sent thousands of dissenters into prisons or worse. The sound of a knock on the door, once just an ordinary occurrence, now became a terrifying harbinger of danger. Would they come for you next? In the classrooms, the air was thick with tension. Teachers whispered of a time when free thought was allowed, when students could question the world around them without fear. Now, every word spoken was measured, weighed against the consequences of speaking out. The regime's reach extended everywhere, into families, into friendships, into the hearts of the people. Fear was a weapon more potent than any gun, and it silenced many who would have otherwise stood against the tyranny. But even in the suffocating grip of censorship, the human spirit found ways to resist. People whispered in the shadows, passing along books, letters, and songs that carried the weight of hope. The resistance was born from the collective will of a nation that refused to be broken. In the face of unimaginable cruelty, ordinary Brazilians became extraordinary. They fought back in the quietest of ways, and even the smallest acts of defiance became revolutionary. In the streets, they gathered in the dark of night, young and old, rich and poor, fighting for their right to speak, to sing, to think freely. It was a time when silence spoke volumes. In the corners of Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, and Recife, music became an act of resistance. The bossa nova, which once filled the streets with joy, became the soundtrack of a nation fighting to remember its soul. Songs that had once celebrated life now carried undertones of rebellion, each note a symbol of defiance against the government that sought to suffocate the nation's voice. But not everyone survived. Many were taken from their homes in the dead of night, tortured, and disappeared. Families wept in silence, not knowing where their loved ones were, if they were even still alive. The regime had perfected the art of invisibility, erasing people without a trace. For those left behind, the unknown was a far worse torment than any physical wound could be. The resistance did not die, though it was pushed into the shadows. Activists, intellectuals, and artists fought to keep the flame of democracy alive, even as it flickered in the dark. Guerrilla movements sprang up, and the sound of gunfire would pierce the silence, though it never lasted long enough to bring down the walls of oppression. The people who fought the dictatorship were not just soldiers or leaders, they were the mothers, the fathers, the brothers and sisters who refused to let Brazil forget who it was. Through it all, the dictatorship promised economic growth and modernization, but the wealth was not shared equally. While the elite flourished, the poor saw little relief. The country was transformed, yes, but not for everyone. In the cities, shiny skyscrapers rose into the sky, but in the favelas, the same families lived without running water or electricity. It was an era of great contrasts, progress for some, suffering for others. But even as the military cracked down on any sign of dissent, the cracks in their iron grip began to show. A generation had grown up under their rule, and many had learned, through the whispers in the dark, that the world outside their prisons was changing. Across the world, movements for freedom were gaining momentum. The very ideals that Brazil's military had crushed began to swell in the hearts of the youth, who no longer believed in the promises of the past. They wanted a future that was their own, free from the heavy hand of the military. By the late 1970s, Brazil was beginning to feel the weight of its own contradictions. Economic prosperity for the elite was no longer enough to mask the deep unrest simmering below the surface. The cries of a generation that had been silenced began to rise once more. There were protests in the streets, marches that shook the very foundations of the military's control. The youth, now emboldened by the struggles of those who had come before them, began to take to the streets in defiance, demanding change, demanding an end to the nightmare. The military government could no longer maintain its stranglehold. The years of resistance, of survival, of quiet revolutions within families, schools, and communities began to blossom into something larger. In 1985, the moment finally arrived. The military, exhausted and facing increasing pressure, agreed to step down, and Brazil once again breathed free. But the scars of the dictatorship would never fade. The fear, the loss, the years of uncertainty, they left their marks on the collective memory of a nation. Those who had resisted, who had fought and sacrificed, held the weight of that history in their hearts. For them, the struggle for democracy was more than just a political battle, it was a fight for the soul of the nation. The years of military rule had broken Brazil in many ways, but they had also forged a new strength in its people. The road to democracy was long and hard, but in the end, it was the will of the people that prevailed. The resistance movements, which had fought so hard for Brazil where freedom and truth could flourish, had won. The dictatorship's reign had come to an end, but the fight for a better future, one built on justice, equality, and freedom, had only just begun. The people who had lived through it, who had fought for it, knew that the scars would always remain, but so too would the hope that they had never let die. On the evening of March 15, 1985, Brazil's long nightmare seemed to break at last. The streets, once hushed in fear, came alive with the sound of 1,000 voices, all singing the same tune of freedom that had been denied for over 2 decades. The oppressive silence that had haunted the country under military rule was finally pierced by the sound of democracy returning. Tancredo Neves had been elected president, and the transition from dictatorship to democracy had begun, but the story was far from simple. The air was thick with anticipation, yet as Neves supporters cheered, the president-elect collapsed suddenly, taken by illness. The man who symbolized a new era of hope and change would never see the office he was elected to. Instead, it was José Sarney, his vice president, who stepped in to carry the weight of the moment, inheriting the hopes and dreams of a fractured nation. The joy in the streets was tempered with an underlying fear. Could this fragile new democracy survive the weight of Brazil's past? Could the country heal from the scars of military rule and the years of suffering that came with it? For years, Brazil had been battered by the realities of dictatorship. People had been punished, erased, and silenced, but now they were rising. The promise of freedom and change was palpable, but the road ahead was steep, lined with challenges and deep-rooted inequalities. As the country shifted to a more democratic system, the memory of what was lost was hard to ignore. It wasn't just the lost lives, the missing families, there was a collective wound that ran deep. Yet, there was also a spark of something bright, the Constitution of 1988, the crowning achievement of Brazil's painful transition. The new constitution was more than just a legal document, it was a symbol of the people's resolve, a testament to their will to rise above the darkness that had gripped their country. It promised a future where democracy was more than just a word on paper. It promised justice, rights for the oppressed, and a nation that could heal its broken past. But, for all the beauty of those words, the reality of implementing them was far more complex. The country's political landscape, though democratic in form, was still marred by old struggles, divisions between the rich and poor, the powerful and powerless. The inequalities of the past still echoed through Brazil's streets, hidden beneath the illusion of progress. Brazil's cities, though growing and bustling with life, were also riddled with poverty. In the countryside, landless peasants continued to fight for their right to the land they worked. The problems that had festered for so long were not easily erased by a new constitution. Brazil had to confront the truths it had avoided for decades, that the poor, especially in the favelas, still had no voice, and that the country's social structures were not as strong as they appeared. With every step toward democracy, there were also steps back. Corruption, which had thrived under the dictatorship, found new forms in the democratic system. The political elite, though no longer military leaders, still held much of the power, and their interests didn't always align with the people's. The deep divisions within society, racial, social, and economic, only grew more visible as the country entered the 1990s. The dream of a unified Brazil seemed distant as people struggled to make ends meet, and the gap between the wealthy and the impoverished seemed to grow wider with each passing day. Yet, amid the struggle, there was also something stirring, a new sense of hope, a determination to move forward despite the obstacles. People began to take the reins of their own future. Social movements, grassroots organizations, and activists fought tirelessly for a fairer society. Workers, women, Afro-Brazilian communities, and indigenous peoples stood together, demanding the rights they had long been denied. Their voices, once silenced by fear, now roared with purpose. The promise of democracy wasn't about a perfect future, it was about a future where every person could have a say in the direction of the country. It was about equality, justice, and the idea that every Brazilian, no matter their race, class, or background, could find a place in the society they built. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a fight worth fighting. In the years that followed, the specter of Brazil's violent past didn't disappear. The memories of those lost to the dictatorship, the families torn apart, and the abuses of the military regime continued to haunt the country. But there was also a growing acknowledgement that the nation could not truly move forward without reckoning with the past. Slowly, the dark history was brought into the light, with truth commissions, human rights trials, and movements to ensure that the horrors of dictatorship would never be forgotten. Despite the country's progress, however, it seemed that the road to real equality remained endless. The social challenges Brazil faced, poverty, racism, inequality, were not easily solved, and many continued to feel the weight of history pressing down on them. It was clear that the victory for democracy was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The Constitution of 1988 had given Brazil the tools it needed to build a better future, but it was up to the people to wield those tools and shape their nation into one that truly reflected their hopes. As Brazil moved into the 21st century, there were victories, but there were also setbacks. The democratic system remained in place, but the struggle for equality was far from over. The promise of justice and opportunity for all was still waiting to be fully realized. Brazil's vibrant streets, once silenced by fear, became the stage for a new kind of struggle, a fight to turn the ideals of democracy into the lived reality for every Brazilian, from the wealthy elites to the forgotten poor. The spirit of the people was tested, time and again, by economic crises, political corruption, and growing inequality. Yet, they persevered. They knew the road ahead would be long, but the fight was worth it. They had learned, over years of struggle, that true democracy wasn't just about elections, it was about the people who were willing to stand up, speak out, and work for a better, more just future. Through each challenge, through each setback, the people of Brazil proved that they were willing to keep fighting. Brazil stood on the precipice, its gaze fixed on the horizon, where the gleaming promise of the future met the shadow of its complex past. The years after the turn of the 21st century were marked by a new wave of ambition, one that swept through the nation, lifting its economy and its people into the global spotlight. From the sprawling cities of São Paulo to the lush rainforests of the Amazon, the sounds of progress were everywhere. But beneath the surface, the stakes were high, and the challenges immense. Brazil's economy surged with unprecedented growth, bringing both hope and fear in equal measure. The world began to take notice of the country's rise as its markets opened up and foreign investors rushed in, drawn by the promise of a booming economy. In the span of a few short years, Brazil's middle class grew larger and its cities began to shine with a new vibrancy. There were those who saw opportunity in every corner, and for a time, it seemed as though Brazil had become the shining star of Latin America. Yet, as the country soared, it also struggled to balance the needs of its booming economy with the environmental toll that came with it. The Amazon, that vast green lung of the planet, began to show signs of strain. Logging, deforestation, and the encroachment of industrial agriculture threatened the very thing that made Brazil unique in the world, a pristine, untamed wilderness that was home to countless species and indigenous peoples. It was a battle between economic progress and the fight for the survival of the planet's most vital ecosystem. As Brazil danced on the world stage, it faced the question, could it grow without destroying the very resources that made it powerful? Could the hunger for wealth be reconciled with the responsibility to protect the land that had been home to generations of Brazilians? These questions haunted policymakers, environmentalists, and ordinary people who had seen their way of life begin to slip away, eroded by the forces of global expansion. And then, there was Brazil's role in the world. It was no longer the silent giant of the past, a country that kept to itself, emerging only when it was absolutely necessary. Instead, Brazil had become a voice on the global stage. It was a member of the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, an economic and political bloc that represented the rising powers of the global South. As a member of BRICS, Brazil found itself in the company of nations that shared its ambition to break free from the shadow of the West, to carve out a place for themselves in the shifting tides of global power. It was a moment of triumph, but also of reflection. Brazil's place in the world was no longer about simply surviving, it was about asserting its influence, making its voice heard on the issues that mattered most to its people and to the world. Yet, as Brazil's influence grew, so too did the complexities of its position. It was not just a rising power, it was a country burdened by a history of inequality, environmental degradation, and a growing divide between the wealthy elite and the poor masses. For many, the question wasn't how far Brazil could rise, but at what cost. The economic boom also brought a wave of urbanization, with people flooding into cities in search of work and opportunity. The favelas grew, sprawling ever outward, their poverty more visible than ever before. Brazil had become a land of contrasts, where the rich lived in towering skyscrapers while the poor struggled in makeshift homes built on the edges of cities. The dream of upward mobility, of a better life, seemed within reach for some, but just out of grasp for many others. In the background, the looming threat of climate change continued to cast a shadow over Brazil's development. The very forests that had made the country the global power in the natural world were at risk, and with them, Brazil's legacy. For the indigenous people of the Amazon, the threat was personal. Their homes, their lands, their cultures were under attack, and they fought to protect them, even as they saw the government and multinational corporations push forward with projects that threatened to destroy everything they held dear. But Brazil was resilient. It had always been resilient. The same people who had fought for independence from colonial rule, who had survived military dictatorship, now found themselves at the heart of a new global struggle. Whether they were marching in the streets for environmental protection, calling for better wages and education, or fighting for the rights of marginalized communities, the spirit of Brazil's people burned brighter than ever before. They had weathered the storm of history, and they would continue to push forward, no matter the challenges. In the international arena, Brazil's voice was loud and clear. It advocated for a more equitable global system, one that reflected the realities of the 21st century. It was no longer a country simply responding to the demands of the world. It was a country that was shaping those demands, standing shoulder to shoulder with the largest economies in the world. Yet, as Brazil stepped forward, it had to confront its internal contradictions. How could it lead on the global stage when so many of its own citizens still lived in poverty? How could it call for environmental responsibility while its forests were disappearing before its eyes? Brazil's rise on the global stage was more than just a story of economic growth. It was the story of a nation grappling with its identity, its past, and its future. The world had its eyes on Brazil, but Brazil had its eyes on itself. It was a country at a crossroads, with its future hanging in the balance. Would it remain true to its roots, to its people, to the land that had nourished it for centuries? Or would it succumb to the pressures of globalization, sacrificing the things that made it unique in the pursuit of wealth and power? As the years passed, the answers to those questions remained elusive. Brazil's path was uncertain, and the weight of its decisions would shape the future for generations to come. Yet, in the heart of the country, amid the struggles and triumphs, there was a belief that Brazil's destiny was in its own hands. Despite the challenges, despite the setbacks, Brazil would rise. Brazil is a land of contrasts, vast stretches of golden beaches, towering skyscrapers, and the dense, wild Amazon rainforest. It is a country shaped by the weight of its history, by the strength and resilience of its people. From the colonial era to its struggles for independence, from its fight against military rule to its quest for a more just and equitable society, Brazil has always been a place where the clash of cultures, ideals, and ambitions creates a tension that both divides and unites. Now, as the country stands at the crossroads of a new era, it faces a future that holds both hope and uncertainty. For centuries, Brazil has carried the legacy of its past, first as a land of exploitation and then as a young nation fighting to define its identity. The scars of colonization, slavery, and inequality still linger in the heart of the nation. Yet, there is something undeniable about the spirit of Brazil. It is a spirit born of survival, of overcoming. In the face of hardships, the people have always found ways to dance, to celebrate, to sing. They have found ways to build lives out of nothing, to create beauty from the chaos. It is this resilience, this relentless push forward, that has shaped the course of the country's history. But as Brazil looks toward the future, the path ahead is not simple. The nation is grappling with questions that cannot be ignored, questions about its relationship with the earth, with its people, and with the world. The Amazon, the beating heart of Brazil, is under threat. Its forests are disappearing at an alarming rate, and with it, a critical part of the world's natural balance. The indigenous peoples, who have lived in harmony with the land for centuries, are fighting to protect it from forces that threaten to consume it. The question is, can Brazil's growth and its environmental future coexist? The world watches as Brazil faces this challenge. It is not alone in this fight. Every nation on Earth must confront the reality of climate change, the devastation of ecosystems, and the consequences of unchecked industrialization. But for Brazil, the stakes are even higher. The loss of the Amazon would not only mean the destruction of a vital ecosystem, it would mean the loss of something far greater. It would mean the erosion of a culture, a way of life that has existed for thousands of years, quietly and unassumingly, beneath the green canopy. Yet even in the face of this crisis, there is hope. Across the country, people are finding new ways to balance progress and preservation. There are communities dedicated to sustainable farming, to protecting the land, to innovating without destroying. There are leaders who recognize that Brazil's strength lies not in its exploitation of the earth, but in its ability to cultivate, to nurture, and to protect. The question, however, is whether these efforts can grow enough to match the scale of the challenges ahead. Brazil's future, like its past, will be shaped by the diversity that runs through its veins. The beauty of Brazil lies not just in its landscapes or its resources, but in the people who call it home. From the Afro-Brazilian communities to the indigenous tribes of the Amazon, from the immigrants who have brought their cultures to the cities to the rural farmers who have lived in the same villages for generations, Brazil is a mosaic of stories, each with its own struggles, dreams, and hopes. Yet, the unity of Brazil is often challenged by the forces of inequality, by the divisions that still exist between the rich and the poor, between the urban elite and the rural laborers, between the government and the people. As the country seeks a future that honors its diversity, the question becomes, can Brazil find a way to bridge these divides, to bring all its people together in the pursuit of a better tomorrow? The struggles are not small. But the triumphs, too, are significant. Across the country, people are fighting for justice, for equality, for opportunity. There are movements dedicated to uplifting the marginalized, to empowering women and children, to giving a voice to the voiceless. The road to true equality, to sustainable development, is long and winding. But Brazil has walked such roads before. It has survived centuries of colonization and oppression. It has risen from the ashes of dictatorship. And it has fought for freedom when freedom seemed impossible. Brazil is a country of survivors, of dreamers, of warriors. Its strength lies in its people, in their ability to come together when the stakes are high. In this new age, as the world becomes more interconnected and the challenges more complex, Brazil has the chance to be a leader not just in terms of economic power, but in terms of social justice and environmental stewardship. The future of Brazil is not just about becoming a stronger economy or a bigger player on the world stage. It's about becoming a country that leads by example, that shows the world what it means to be both prosperous and compassionate, both powerful and caring. But these ambitions come with their own set of trials. Social inequality remains one of Brazil's most difficult challenges. The wealthy continue to amass fortunes, while the poor struggle to make ends meet. The favelas of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo are teeming with people who have been left behind by the promises of prosperity. In rural areas, farmers battle for access to land and basic resources. In cities, access to education, healthcare, and employment is still a privilege for a select few. The divide is deep, but the desire for change is stronger than ever. For many, the hope is that the future of Brazil can be one where no one is left behind, where the riches of the country are shared by all. It is a hope that lives in the hearts of students marching for their rights, and the voices of workers demanding better conditions, and the hands of farmers fighting to protect the land. Brazil's future is not written yet. It is still being shaped by those who have come before and by those who will come after. Brazil's legacy is one of struggle and survival. But in the face of the challenges ahead, it can also be a legacy of hope, of renewal, of a country that learns from its past, honors its diversity, and builds a future where everyone has a place. The question is not whether Brazil can overcome its struggles, it is whether its people can come together, with strength and with love, to build a nation that honors both the land and its people.